A family moved into their dream home, and within 18 months the floor in the hallway had dropped almost an inch. Nobody could explain it. The walls looked fine, the paint wasn't cracked, but something underneath that house was quietly failing, and it had passed inspection just 2 years earlier. If you're the kind of person who notices things other homeowners walk right past, subscribe now, because every week we dig into real building failures, the ones hiding behind drywall and under floors, and we show you exactly what to look for before it costs you thousands. At first glance, this house looked perfect. New siding, a freshly poured driveway, a roof that still had that clean, unweathered look. It was the kind of home that photographs beautifully for a listing. But inspectors aren't paid to look at what's beautiful. They're paid to look at what's underneath, and sometimes even they miss things. The hallway sag started small. The homeowners noticed a slight bounce when they walked across it, the kind of thing you might blame on old shoes or an uneven rug. Most people would have ignored it, but this family called a structural engineer, and that decision changed everything. Here's where it gets interesting. When the engineer pulled back the subfloor, he found something that should never have made it past a building inspection. A support beam in the crawl space had been undersized for the span it was carrying. Not by a small margin, by a lot. To understand why this matters, imagine a bookshelf. If you build a shelf too long for the wood you're using, it sags in the middle under the weight of the books. A support beam works the same way. Every beam is rated for a specific distance it can safely cross before it needs another post or wall underneath it. Builders call this the span. Get the span wrong and gravity does the rest, slowly, silently, for years. In this house, the beam had been stretched almost 4 feet beyond what it was rated to carry. On paper, it looked like a small shortcut. In reality, it was a structural failure waiting to happen. Every single day the family lived there. But here's where everything changed. The engineer wanted to know how this passed inspection in the first place, so he pulled the original permit records. And what he found revealed something most homeowners never think to check. The inspection had happened before the flooring was installed, which is normal. But the framing inspection was rushed. Records showed the inspector covered 11 other properties that same day. 11. A thorough framing inspection on a single home can take a solid hour when done correctly, checking every beam, every span, every connection point. Do the math, and it becomes obvious something had to give. This is the hidden truth about building inspections that almost nobody outside the industry understands. An inspection is not a guarantee. It's a checkpoint, run by human beings, on a schedule, often under pressure to move fast. Most of the time it works, but when it doesn't, the consequences don't show up right away. They show up years later, in a hallway that quietly starts to sag. What happened next surprised even the contractor who had built the home. Once the beam issue was exposed, the engineer kept looking, because in construction, one hidden mistake is rarely alone. Underneath the same crawl space, insulation had been shoved against the foundation vents, blocking airflow that was supposed to keep moisture from building up. This might sound minor compared to a structural beam, but it's actually one of the most common and most expensive mistakes in residential construction. A crawl space needs to breathe. Moisture rises from the soil, especially after rain, and if that moisture has nowhere to escape, it settles into the wood framing above it. Slowly, invisibly, the wood begins to weaken. Picture 2 identical support beams, side by side. One sits in a dry, properly ventilated crawl space. The other sits in a space where moisture has nowhere to go. Over 10 years, the first beam looks almost the same as the day it was installed. The second beam has begun to soften, develop dark staining, and in some cases, invite wood-destroying insects that thrive in damp, hidden environments. Same wood, same house, completely different outcome, all because of one blocked vent. Most homeowners never notice this, because crawl space vents are the last thing anyone thinks to check when buying a home. They're low to the ground, often covered in landscaping, and easy to forget even exist. But contractors who do this work every day will tell you, the crawl space tells the truth about a house long before the walls do. Now comes the part that costs homeowners the most money. When the family in this story got a full inspection report, the estimate to properly repair the undersized beam, add correct support posts, and restore ventilation came in at a number that shocked them. Structural repairs involving foundation and framing work are consistently among the most expensive fixes in residential construction, often costing far more than cosmetic renovations because the work has to happen from below, often in tight, difficult spaces, and it has to be done precisely or the fix creates new problems of its own. But the biggest mistake hadn't even happened yet. As the repair crew went to install new support posts, they discovered the original footings. The concrete pads that support posts sit on were poured too shallow. In many regions, footings need to reach below the frost line, the depth at which the ground freezes in winter. If a footing sits above that line, the ground beneath it can freeze and expand, then thaw and shrink, over and over, year after year. Builders call this frost heave, and it can slowly push a foundation element out of position without anyone realizing it's happening until cracks appear. This is where the story shifts from a single mistake to a pattern. A beam that was too weak, ventilation that was blocked, footings poured too shallow. None of these problems would have caused a dramatic, sudden collapse. That's actually what makes them so dangerous. They are slow, quiet failures, the kind that let a family live comfortably for a year or two before the first warning sign appears. There was one critical detail almost nobody noticed during the original construction, and it explains a lot about how these mistakes happened in the first place. The framing crew that built this section of the house was subcontracted during an unusually busy season when demand for new homes in the area had spiked. Crews were stretched thin, schedules were tight, and speed became the priority. This is not an excuse. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in construction failures across the country. When the building industry moves faster than quality control can keep up, corners get cut, sometimes without anyone intending to cut them at all. This hidden detail changes everything about how we should think about a past inspection. A green sticker on a wall or a signed permit doesn't mean a house is perfect. It means the house met the minimum requirements the inspector was able to verify in the time they had on that particular day. For most homes, that's enough. For a percentage of homes, it isn't. And the only way to know which category your house falls into is to look closer than the inspector did. So what does a professional do differently when problems like this are caught? The first step is always documentation. Every issue gets measured, photographed, and compared against current building code requirements for that specific region, because codes vary depending on climate, soil type, and local conditions. A beam span that's acceptable in one state might be undersized in another, simply because snow loads or soil conditions are different. Once the problems are documented, the repair sequence matters enormously. You never simply rip out a failing beam and replace it. Professionals install temporary support first, carefully jacking the structure to relieve pressure on the damaged section, sometimes just a fraction of an inch at a time, monitoring the house as they go to avoid creating new cracks or misalignments elsewhere. Rushing this step is exactly the kind of shortcut that created the original problem, and doing it wrong can turn a bad situation into a genuinely dangerous one. With the load safely supported, the undersized beam gets replaced with one properly sized for the span, sometimes paired with an additional support post to shorten the distance the beam has to cover. Shortening the span isn't just a repair trick. It's often the smarter long-term solution because it reduces stress on the wood permanently rather than just meeting the minimum requirement. For the ventilation problem, the fix looks deceptively simple, but requires real judgment. Clearing blocked vents restores airflow, but in some cases, the smarter long-term solution is sealing the crawl space entirely and installing a vapor barrier along the ground, paired with a dehumidification system. This approach, sometimes called crawl space encapsulation, has become increasingly popular because it removes moisture as a variable altogether, rather than relying on passive airflow that can be blocked again in the future by landscaping, debris, or a homeowner who doesn't realize what those vents are for. The footing issue required the most invasive fix. Contractors had to excavate around the affected posts, pour new footings that extended below the frost line for that specific region, and allow proper curing time before transferring weight back onto them. This kind of repair can't be rushed. Concrete needs time to reach its full strength, and loading it too early can compromise the very fix that was supposed to solve the problem. Here's the comparison that really puts this into perspective. Doing this work correctly from the start, sizing the beam properly, maintaining ventilation, and pouring footings to the correct depth adds a relatively small percentage to the overall cost of building a home. Fixing the same problems after the fact, once they're hidden behind finished walls and flooring, costs dramatically more, both in materials and in the specialized labor required to access spaces that were never meant to be reopened. This gap between prevention and repair is one of the most consistent patterns across construction failures nationwide, and it's the single biggest reason experienced contractors obsess over getting the framing stage right the first time. Could this have been prevented? Almost certainly. A more thorough framing inspection would likely have caught the undersized beam before the flooring ever went down. A homeowner walkthrough during construction, even an informal one, might have caught the blocked vents, and a soil analysis before pouring footings would have confirmed the correct depth needed for that specific property and region. This is why more and more home buyers, especially those purchasing newly built homes, are choosing to hire an independent inspector of their own, separate from the one required by the municipality. It might feel redundant, paying for a second set of eyes on a home that already passed official inspection. But as this story shows, official inspection and thorough inspection are not always the same thing. A private inspector isn't juggling 11 properties in a single day. They have one job, one house, and the time to actually do it right. For existing homeowners, the lesson is just as valuable. A slight bounce in the floor, a door that suddenly doesn't close quite right, a crack that appears where a wall meets the ceiling. These are not cosmetic annoyances. They're often the first visible signs of something invisible happening beneath the surface, and the homeowners who catch these signals early are almost always the ones who avoid the largest repair bills. By the time the repair crew finished this particular project, the beam had been replaced, the crawl space had been properly sealed and conditioned, and new footings anchored the structure well below the frost line. The hallway that once sagged now sits level. The family who lived with a mystery for over a year finally understood what had been happening beneath their feet the entire time. What makes this story worth telling isn't just the repair itself, it's what it reveals about how homes actually get built in this country. Most contractors are skilled, careful professionals who take real pride in their work. But the system they operate in is not always designed to catch every mistake, especially during periods when demand outpaces the people available to inspect it properly. Understanding that gap doesn't mean distrusting every home you walk into. It means knowing exactly where to look and knowing that a past inspection is a starting point for confidence, not a final guarantee. The next time you walk through a home, whether it's one you're buying, one you already own, or one you're simply touring out of curiosity, remember that the most expensive problems are rarely the ones you can see. They're sitting quietly in a crawl space, behind a vent that's been blocked for years, or in a beam that was never quite strong enough for the job it was given. The house will keep that secret for as long as it can. Sometimes that's a year, sometimes it's a decade. But eventually the truth always finds its way to the surface. If this kind of investigation opened your eyes to something you'll never look at the same way again, come back next week, because there's always another house with another hidden story. And there's always something new to learn about what's really holding your home together.